This is the Ministry of Health, from where it all started. It all started here, and this is where it all ended. We are speaking about the story of the COVID-19 and the National COVID-19 Secretariat, right from where it began in the days of the National Emergency Command Center. This was the story in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, which started in China, Wuhan, in 2019 by December. By the time we got to 2020, we were dealing with this issue in Lesotho. In dealing with it, we had to find ways of mitigating the pandemic. Did we manage to do that? That's a story for another day. But today we are going to talk about the life and times of the National COVID-19 Secretariat, Nacosec, as it came to be popularly known. A couple of days ago, Cabinet reached a decision to dissolve or disband the Nacosec. As for whether that's a good or bad decision by government, also that's a story for another day. But today we're going to talk about, was it effective? Was it necessary? Did we benefit? Or was it merely just an issue of everyday bread and butter affairs? I am not Lerato Matek, but this is public opinion. And today we are talking about the dissolving of the National COVID-19 Secretariat, Nacosec. It is exactly 2 years since we started with the first national lockdown, which was hard, which was red, which was intense. It happened around the end of March 2020. Today is 2022. That makes it exactly 2 years, doesn't it? It does. And then we did the first lockdown. People were complaining, people were crying, business was crumbling. It was a mess. But we were told it was a pandemic, it was a crisis, it was an emergency. We had to deal with it, we had to listen. So an establishment of a body to deal with the new pandemic was done. So we had the National Emergency Command Center on COVID-19, which lasted a few months. To be precise, I think it lasted no more than 4 months. It changed with the changes of time. The administration of the then Prime Minister Tom Thabane was replaced by that of the new Prime Minister, who was at the time his Minister of Finance, Dr. Mwekitsi Major. Upon his assuming of office, he actually introduced a new entity to deal with the new pandemic. That was known as the National COVID-19 Secretariat, Nacosec, as it later became popularly known. A lot happened along the way of the work, Bupeloba Nacosec. There was a lot of questions, a lot of doubts, and a lot of this and that, and it delivered on its mandate. Did it? That's another story for another day. Hopefully, as we continue the talk in this series, we might get to discussing on that issue. But today, we want to address the issue of its disbanding, dissolving, and the end of its time, and maybe some of the highlights of what it did during its time. First of all, it came as opposed to the NECC, or the National Emergency Command Center, with a huge staff complement, made up mostly of persons from outside the civil service, at the expense of its predecessor, the NECC, which was made up mostly of members of staff from the civil society, from the civil service, public service, with this large staff base came a huge wage bill. For instance, its first chief executive officer, the Commissioner General of the Lesotho Revenue Authority, LRA, Thabo Khasip, was said to be expected to be paid no less than 408,000 per annum. Handsome, isn't it? But then, thankfully, as true to his nature, he rejected it. And then he said, I'm not going to take this extra cash, but I'm going to rely on my daytime, everyday job pay at the LRA. And I'm going to do this in a show of goodwill. Because he understood that the country was dealing with a pandemic. He understood that we were in crisis. With him came a huge staff base, like I said. For example, the Auditor General's report that was released a couple of weeks ago, or by the end of March 2020, told us that entities or bodies that were established to deal with the virus were established outside the provisions of law. Interesting. But anyway, we were dealing with a crisis, so we had to look away from anything and focus on the matter at hand, because it was an emergency, because it was a crisis, because it was a disaster. Be that as it may, we already have legal provisions, the DMA Act, which already provides for manpower, legal provisions, as well as the technical know-how to deal with disasters. But no, in dealing with this one, it was a new one. So we had to establish a new thing. So everything was new. So we brought a big staff base with a large chunks of monies to pay. For instance, the Auditor General says that the Chief Finance Officer of this entity was being paid 70,000 a month. Yeah, you got it right. And yet on paper it was being said that people were receiving honoraria. For somebody to be getting that, they need to get no more than 5,000. And once after the completion of the assignment. But in this case, we were getting people who were getting paid from 20,000 a month. Interesting, isn't it? So it worked. It did its magic amidst lots and lots of controversy. For example, after the first chief executive did his first 3 months in office, he quit. And then he made way for Dr. Marita as the new executive, the chief executive. Yeah, you remember her. She famously did that. That's what she became famous for. And then after she did her time as well, amidst a lot of controversies, she made way for the number one, Mr. Thabo Ntoi, the number one boogeyman. He is the one who ushered the Secretariat up to where we are, where we said our goodbyes to its death a couple of days ago. Mr. Thabo Ntoi is one of the most interesting features inside the Nacosec. You know why? Because he made some of the most interesting decisions. For example, he is on record as telling the world that the famous maxim by which health practitioners swear, yeah, doctor-patient confidentiality, you know what he said about that? Forget about that, man. We're dealing with COVID-19. This is a crisis. Doctor-patient confidentiality, or for what? No. At one point, he was advising government through its many decisions, through the many phases of the lockdown that were changing with each and every coming time. For example, a couple of weeks ago, we need to highlight this very important issue here. For every decision that was being made by cabinet or government, Nacosec was the one which was providing counsel or advice. And then he famously said they were very proud of all the counsel that they were providing to government, which is good. That was their call for duty. At one point, they advised government to introduce this ubiquitous vaccination practice where everybody needs to be vaccinated. And then thankfully, to their credit, they had told us a couple of months ago that they were quite satisfied with the progress that was being made as far as the vaccination, because at least over 50% of the population was vaccinated. So they encouraged and advised government to lift some of the restrictions on COVID-19. Some of these restrictions, or most of them, were lifted. And then a couple of weeks later, they came back to advise government to do what? To introduce booster shots. with no statistical records, with no statistical evidence to show that maybe the status of the virus had changed for the worse. Interesting, isn't so? But anyway, it was launched. People started getting booster shots. Right from the top, from the royal family, they got their booster shots. And as if that was not enough, we started experiencing instances where we were, as a country, doubting our very own vaccination. We were now coming into loggerheads with the South African authorities who had introduced a new set of rules altogether, which was opposite to what we were doing. This side, we were introducing booster shots. That side, they were lifting restrictions and saying people could actually cross the border without having to be tested again, so long as they had been vaccinated. But in our case this time, as if to justify their existence, they wanted us to continue observing what was. Yet times had changed, and yet they had already advised government to the contrary. Unlike its counterparts from other countries elsewhere, our entity that ended up operating from this amazing building here was made up of maybe a group of well-wishing ladies and gentlemen. Technical expertise in dealing with health issues? Well, that's our story for another day. For example, the chief executive officer was a well-experienced administrator. If you were to look at persons of his status elsewhere in other countries, we'll be talking about persons of the status of doctors with an understanding and technical know-how on the medical field. But also, maybe we'll deal with that as we deal with other chapters in this series. We were experiencing a large financial gash which was being created by Nacosec. At one point, it was said that they had blown more than 1.5 billion. Yeah, I said B, the big one, 1.5 billion on salaries and the upkeep of the personnel, because it had a very large staff base. At the time of his death a couple of weeks ago, Nacosec was apparently being run on a wage bill of a little over 500,000 a month for a staff base of around 32 persons. That means 500,000 every month for God knows how many months. So the decision to dissolve or disband Nacosec was a long time coming. If we had a government, if we had an administration with a vision, this should have been realized a long time ago. If we had an administration and leadership that understood counsel, provided among others by Auditor General, we would have long realized that it was established under questionable legal provisions. It was operating under questionable financial provisions. It was providing questionable counsel. But at the end of the day, we are thankful that the end of Nacosec marks end of an era of error. This is public opinion. Until we meet next time.